So in community ecology, several number of species or several number of populations, in this case species, has its own role in the community. Okay, so we have two terms or general terms for species, referring to its role in a community. We have foundation species and we have keystone species. So for foundation species, it plays a unique, essential role in creating and defining a community. Why? It is because the foundation species act by modifying the environment so that it can support the other organisms that forms the community. Example, we have kelps and you have corals. Okay, so foundation species like kelps. In kelps, it helps create environment that allow the survival of other organisms that make up the kelp forest communities. So some of the fishes or other aquatic organisms within the kelp forest created by the kelp population is a parang safe haven of some of these organisms that escape from their predator or to hide from their predators. Okay, so they create a specific community because of their large leaves, large structure in aquatic ecosystem. Another example, you have the corals in the coral reef. Okay, so the exoskeleton of living and dead corals make up the reef structure with protection for other species from waves and other ocean currents. Okay, so it is also responsible especially for dead corals, to recreate again a substrate for coral organisms. Okay, so in some instances, for example, for freshwater ecosystems, beavers also is an example of foundation species. They can modify their environment by building dams. Okay, so beavers are associated to freshwater ecosystem. Nagbe-build sila ng dams gamit ang mga um, branches na nahulog sa puno to create a dam. Doon din sila kumukuha ng pagkain, doon din sila naliligo since they are commonly associated to wet environment or water or freshwater environment. Yan. Okay? So what is the difference of foundation species, or what seems to be the distinguishing feature of foundation species to keystone species? Ang keystone species naman is a species that has disproportionately large effect on the community, okay? Community structure relative to its biomass or abundance. So kung marami sila, um, ano yung magiging effect? Or there is something effect kung mawawala or magre-reduce sila ng number. For example, if you have the Pisaster um, Ocaris, Ocrasius, this is a sea star. So this sea star is actually a control or a keystone species that controls the population of the kelp or other sea algae and the mussels. So, kinoconsume nyo kasi yung mga algae at yung mussels. So, there is an experiment that's being conducted in the Book of Smith na pag tinanggal mo to in an experimental station, yung population ng the sea star, tumataas ngayon yung population ng mussels at ng algae. So the presence of this particular species or keystone species is a controlling mechanism of the population of mussels and the algae in that particular intertidal zone. And another example, you the sea otter. Sea otters since consume mussels, abalone, and sea urchin. So these are some aquatic species. So, nako-control niya yung population nito at nako-control din yung consumption ng kelp in that particular community. So, since they are feeding to kelp, okay, since nandyan ang sea otter, nako-control din yung pagkawala ng kelp mismo. Kasi naapektuhan niya, kung mawawala yung kelp, mawawala din yung kelp community or kelp forest. So the existence of sea otter, okay, is very important to the existence of the kelp forest. Kasi kung wala to, walang magko-control sa population nila, so mauubos din yung forest kasi kiko-consume ng mga organism na to. Kumbaga, the presence of keystone species balances the number of different species in that particular community. Okay? So nababalance niya, it is because of its existence, which controls other organism. Okay? Due to its what do you call it? Feeding guild, kumbaga. Kung ano yung kinakain niya na other organism. So there is actually balance. So keystone species differ from foundation species. First, they are more likely to belong to higher trophic levels. Nasa mataas na level sila. Kumbaga, they can be considered in a particular community, they can be considered as the top predator or nasa peak or nasa top ng food chain or ng food web. They act in more diverse ways than foundation species which tend to modify their environment. Modification in terms of controlling the number of individuals that may fed to another individuals which will affect the community structure. Okay? Ayan. So, there are other keystone species and the different communities. So, for your assignment, I need you to search for at least two different keystone and foundation species in a particular community and then explain how they become foundation and keystone species. So you have two example species for foundation and you have two example species for keystone species. That is due next week. That is November 10. So please submit your assignment. Okay. So aside from the presence of foundation or the different roles of species as foundation and keystone species play, we have also what we so called community change instability in a community. So how does a particular community change? How they become stable after disturbances. So that is included in the discussion of community ecology. And talking about change and stability, so community structure varies in time and space. So there's temporal and you have spatial changes or variations. So that is across landscape, which creates the zonation, okay, that I discussed to you in the first few slides. And one time position as time passes by. Kasi nagbabago at nagbabago siya through time kasi there are different disturbances, di ba? We've discussed different disturbances that shapes a particular community structure. So that disturbances, okay, through time, changes the particular community. Darating disturbance, okay, magre-regenerate ang community, that takes time, okay? And talking about the changes in the structure given the specific time, okay, after a specific disturbance, we have what we so-called, or after a certain period of time, there is what we so-called ecological succession. Okay, so when you say ecological succession, it is a gradual and directional change of community structure through time from field to forest. Okay, this field to forest has something to do with the type of ecological succession. So, for example, you have the time factor here. So, a barren exposed rock, okay, certain stages of development until such time that it reached their um, specific vegetation, okay? Yan, may tawag po dito. We will discuss that one later. Okay? Okay, so there are changes in the components or structure of the community as time goes by. So, lichens and mosses, smaller forms of plants. You have annual weeds, you have perennial weeds, you have the shrubs, small trees, and large trees, kumbaga. So these different stages of or gradual changes in the community structure, okay, is what we so called ecological succession with the time factor. Okay. So community change and stability. So the process of succession is common to all terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. That happens in both. Okay. So for example, if you have this particular graph here, this is the graph or succession of a particular aquatic community with different populations of algae, green, brown, and red algae. So as you can see, the first uh, yung first na organisms na nag-exist in that particular aquatic environment in early succession, mataas ang population ng ulva. This is ulva. And then, at quite some time, okay, entering the mid-succession, bumaba siya because of the emergence of other species like um, Geigartina and another species of Geigartina. So, medyo bumaba siya. And then, when the time comes na paakyat ng paakyat yung dalawang species ng Gargantea, okay, bumaba siya. And then there's sudden shift na naman na tumaas, okay, kasama ng Gargantea. And bumaba siya ulit. Okay? So, dito nag-start din ng emerge yung isa na namang red algae which is Gelidium. Gelidium. Okay? So, as you can see, medyo lower lang yung percentage ng rhodoglossum. It's a red algae also. So, as you can see, there are various changes. And then, after the mid-succession, sa late succession niya, makikita mo na ang nag-dominate, kumbaga, ang magdo-dominate is Gargantia as compared to other species. It's already the what? The brown algae as compared to green and red algae in the late succession. So there is gradual change in the number of individuals of the different species of algae in aquatic environment in the different levels of succession, early, mid, and late succession. So, most probably, if you're talking to the variations of the number of individuals in different stages of succession, there might be some factors or environmental conditions that affects the population of the two, which favors the increase in the population of Geigartina as compared to other algae species in the late succession. So, pwedeng ganun ang mangyari. So, the condition in the late succession favors the increase in the population of the Geigartina species as compared sa early na mas marami ang ulva. In terrestrial environment, ito din, in different trees or small tree species, usually that is in winter. So, in several late or past years, nauna nag-encroach sa community ang beech at sugar maple until such time na nag-emerge ang population nila pink cherry, raspberry, and yellow birch. Sa yellow birch, walang problema kasi konti lang din yung number or biomass or percentage in community. However, na-overpower ni pink cherry in the later years yung community. Mas dumami siya as compared sa sugar maple and beech. Okay? Ang raspberry din tumaas but then bumaba. So in this case, there's something to do with the environmental condition or the reproductive success of pin cherry in that particular community kaya siya tumaas on the later years. Okay? Na dati ay inoccupy ng beech and sugar maple. So these are gradual changes in the community. May pagbabago in terms of the species composition. It is because there might be some environmental conditions that also change, okay, through time. So that is part of ecological succession. So the sequence of communities from grass to shrub to forest has been called the seer. Okay, so these are the change or the sequence of events. And the different changes, you have different stages, tinatawag yung seral stage. So each seral stage has its character structure and species composition. It may last 1 to 2 years for several decades. So, the patterns of succession are not random. Okay? Hindi siya mauuna doon sa maraming trees. Hindi. Sequence po yan siya. Parang the first event is parang nagiging irreversible process siya. So, nauuna yung tinatawag na early succession species, the pioneer species, with this particular characteristic. So, at later time, ayun na nag-start na mag-encroach ang successional species until such time na ma-reach mo yung what we so-called the climax stage. Okay? Or the climax seral stage. Ito na yung malakihang forest na talaga siya with different large trees. Okay? So makikita mo na parang R strategies yung nauuna, and have K strategies yung sa later part na ng succession. So for example, the early several stage R strategies yung mga pioneering species, yung mga annual plants, mga grasses, until mag-change yan into shrubs. You have softwoods and pines, and you have the K strategies, you have the climax stage. Yun na yung malalaking trees, for example, in a particular vegetation. Okay? So there are two types of ecological succession. You have primary succession, you have secondary succession. So primary succession, maano mo that succession starts in a barren area. So yung parang rocks. So through time, nangyayari yun, mag-encroach na ngayon yung mga lower forms of animals like lichens. So lichens can aid as they become substrate to plants. Lichens and mosses can aid to weathering of rocks, which creates soil particles. Okay? So creation ng soil particles ngayon will provide a venue for the growth of other plant species like of annual herbs and plants. So continue pa rin yung weathering process until such time na dadami na yung soil particles, which favors the growth of some shrubs, dadami ng dadami, creation of small trees until such time na magiging climax stage na siya, or climax community, which are made up of large trees already. In ecological and secondary succession naman, may disturbance na nangyayari. Dati siyang vegetated area, pero for example, nasunog, dine-forest, may clearing na nangyayari, or may landslide for example. So, magiging parang empty space, kumbaga, or may mga fragments na lang ng dating vegetation. So ngayon, yung na-disturb na area na yon, medyo magiging clear na yan siya. So, dadaan ulit siya ng process ng succession. Mauuna ulit yung grasses, small shrub, into the climax species. But it takes time. Always remember, succession or the stages of succession takes time. Ang pinagkaiba lang ng primary sa secondary, yung primary, wala talaga. These are made of rocks. Okay? Na nagkakaroon ng withering because of the actions of lower forms of animals and other factors. Ito naman sa secondary, may vegetation na siya, kaso lang may disturbance na nangyayari which was responsible for the clearing of the area. Okay? So after that disturbance, dadaan ulit siya sa process ng succession. Okay? So if you will ask me kung nagsa-stop yung succession process sa isang vegetation, that is your assignment. So aside from the keystone and foundation species, your assignment is do ecological succession stops, or does ecological succession stops? Okay? So yes or no, then justify your answer. So that is your assignment for this topic. So that is the first part of community ecology. So we have discussed structure, we have discussed keystone and foundation species, what are the factors that affects community structure, and of course, the changes and stability of the community, primarily looking onto ecological succession.